An elderly millionaire chased his dog under a bridge and encountered a homeless woman with a child. When she mentioned her last name, the millionaire froze in shock. He took her out of there. Then he revealed a secret that changed everything. Rachel's reflection stared back at her from the bathroom mirror, but it wasn't the face she remembered from just 6 months ago. The blisters had started small, tiny, angry red bumps that appeared along her jawline during her 2nd month of pregnancy. She dismissed them at first, thinking they were stress-related, or perhaps a reaction to the cheap face wash she'd been using. But they spread like wildfire across her cheeks, her forehead, even down her neck, creating an angry constellation of raised, weeping sores that no amount of concealer could hide. "It's probably just hormonal," she had whispered to herself in those early days, running her fingers gently over the inflamed skin. "It'll go away after the baby comes." But Harry's reaction had been immediate and unmistakable. The man who once traced her features with reverent fingers, who called her beautiful every morning over coffee, now averted his eyes when she entered a room. The first cruel comment came disguised as concern. "Maybe you should see a doctor about that," he'd said, gesturing vaguely toward her face while reading the sports section. "I mean, what if it's contagious or something?" Rachel had laughed it off, placing a protective hand over the small bump beginning to show beneath her work uniform. "The doctor says it's rare but not unheard of. Some women just react this way to pregnancy hormones. It should clear up after—" "Should," Harry had interrupted, his voice flat. "But what if it doesn't? What if this is just how you look now?" The question hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Rachel felt something cold settle in her stomach, separate from the gentle fluttering of their growing child. She studied Harry's profile as he deliberately kept his attention on the newspaper, noting the tight line of his mouth, the way his shoulders had tensed. "You'd still love me," she said, but it came out sounding more like a question than a statement. Harry's silence was answer enough. The deterioration happened gradually, then all at once. Harry began working longer hours, claiming his boss needed him for overtime. He stopped reaching for her in bed, citing fatigue or stress. When she tried to initiate intimacy, he'd gently but firmly redirect her attention to something else. A movie, a household chore, anything that didn't require him to look at her face or touch her changing body. Rachel threw herself into creating the perfect home, as if she could love him back to her through sheer domestic excellence. She learned to cook his favorite meals, ironed his work shirts until they were crisp and professional, kept their small inherited house spotless despite working 10-hour shifts at the grocery store. She was a night stalker, hauling boxes and restocking shelves from midnight until dawn, then coming home to slip quietly into bed beside a husband who increasingly felt like a stranger. The house itself had been Harry's one stable inheritance, a modest 2-bedroom bungalow with creaky floors and outdated appliances that his mother had left him when cancer took her 3 years earlier. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and Rachel had poured her heart into making it feel like a real home. She'd sewn curtains for the kitchen windows, planted herbs in small pots on the windowsill, arranged and rearranged their few pieces of furniture until every corner felt intentional and loved. But love, Rachel was learning, couldn't be earned through perfect housekeeping or home-cooked meals. "I ran into Melissa at the hardware store today," Harry mentioned casually one evening, not meeting her eyes. Melissa worked at the bank downtown, blonde, polished, with the kind of smooth, unmarked skin that Rachel now looked at with desperate envy. "That's nice," Rachel replied, though something in his tone made her stomach clench. "She was asking about you." "About the pregnancy?" Harry paused, seemingly choosing his words carefully. "I told her you've been having some complications." Rachel set down her fork, her appetite vanishing. "Complications?" "Well, the skin thing. And, we never really planned for this baby. It just happened." The casual cruelty of his words hit her like a physical blow. Yes, the pregnancy had been unplanned, but she had thought, hoped that Harry would grow excited about it as she had. She'd spent hours imagining their child's first steps in the small backyard, their first words at the kitchen table where she and Harry shared their morning coffee. "I know we didn't plan it," she said quietly, "but I thought you were happy about it." "You said you were happy." Harry shrugged, finally looking directly at her for the first time in weeks. The disgust in his eyes was no longer hidden behind polite concern. "I said a lot of things." That night, Rachel lay awake listening to Harry's breathing, one hand resting on her growing belly. At 5 months, the baby had begun moving regularly, little flutters and kicks that felt like butterfly wings against her palm. The end came swiftly, with the efficiency of someone who had been planning it for weeks. Rachel arrived home from her shift one Thursday morning to find suitcases in the living room and a woman she didn't recognize making coffee in her kitchen. Melissa, she realized with a sick jolt of recognition. The woman was even more beautiful up close, with clear, glowing skin and the kind of effortless elegance that came from never having to worry about where your next meal would come from. "Harry?" Rachel called, her voice echoing strangely in what had been her home just hours earlier. He emerged from their bedroom, looking sheepish but determined. "Rachel, we need to talk." "About what exactly?" She gestured toward Melissa, who had the grace to look uncomfortable but made no move to leave. "About why there's another woman making coffee in my kitchen." "It's not your kitchen," Harry said quietly. "It's not your house. It never was." The words hit her like a slap. Legally, he was right. The house was his inheritance, and they had never married, despite her hopes and his vague promises about someday. But she had lived there for 2 years, had made it their home, had believed it was their life they were building together. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, one hand instinctively moving to protect her belly. "I'm 5 months pregnant, Harry." "With your child?" His jaw tightened. "That was your choice." "I made it clear I wasn't ready for kids." "When? When did you make that clear? When you told me you loved me? When you said we had a future together?" Melissa cleared her throat awkwardly. "Maybe I should go." "No," Harry said firmly. "Stay. This won't take long." He turned back to Rachel, his expression hardening. "Look at yourself, Rachel. Really look. Is this what you want our kid to inherit? This condition? And what kind of life can you provide? You stock shelves for minimum wage. You don't even have a high school diploma." Each word was carefully chosen to wound, and they found their mark. Rachel had always been sensitive about her education, about the gaps in her knowledge that came from aging out of the foster system at 18 with nothing but a GED and a garbage bag full of donated clothes. "I'm a hard worker," she said, hating how defensive she sounded. "I've never asked you for anything." "I pay my share of the bills. I take care of the house." "The house I own," Harry interrupted. The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. Rachel felt something inside her chest crack and crumble, like a dam giving way to a flood of cold water. She looked at this man she had loved so completely, had built her entire identity around pleasing, and finally saw him clearly, for the first time. "I want you out by tonight." Rachel nodded slowly, surprised by her own calmness. The tears she expected didn't come. Perhaps she had cried them all out in advance during those long nights when she had sensed this moment approaching, like a distant storm. "All right," she said simply. Harry seemed taken aback by her lack of protest. She looked around the kitchen one last time, taking in the herb pots on the windowsill, the carefully chosen curtains, the small touches that had made this place feel like home. "I'll pack my things and go." When Harry tried to help her carry boxes to her car, a gesture of guilt, not kindness, Rachel stopped him with a look that could have frozen fire. "Don't touch my things," she said. As she loaded the last box into her small sedan, Harry appeared in the doorway, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Rachel, I'm sorry it didn't work out." She turned to study his face one final time, memorizing the features she had once found so handsome. "No, you're not," she said calmly. "You're sorry you couldn't find an easier way to do this. But you're not sorry it's over." Harry opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. Rachel drove away without looking back, her hands steady on the steering wheel despite the magnitude of what had just happened. In the rearview mirror, she could see Harry still standing in the doorway watching her leave. Soon he was just a small figure, then gone entirely as she turned the corner. It was only then, alone in her car with all her worldly possessions crammed into the back seat and trunk, that the full weight of her situation settled over her. She was 30 years old, 5 months pregnant, and completely alone in the world. The blisters on her face throbbed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of everything she had lost. But as she drove through the familiar streets of the town she would now have to leave behind, Rachel felt something unexpected stirring alongside her fear and grief. A fierce, protective love for the child growing inside her. This baby would never know the abandonment she had experienced, never doubt their worth the way she had learned to doubt her own. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, one hand resting on her belly as she drove toward an uncertain future. "I don't know how, but we're going to be okay." The road stretched out before them, empty but full of possibilities she couldn't yet imagine. The vinyl seats of Rachel's aging Honda had become her world, cramped, uncomfortable, but undeniably hers. She had pushed the front seats as far forward as they would go, creating a makeshift living space in the back where she could stretch out her aching body as her pregnancy progressed. A pillow from her former life served as a headrest, while a thin blanket Harry had overlooked during her hurried packing provided minimal warmth during the increasingly cold autumn nights. Her routine had become mechanical, driven by necessity rather than choice. Each morning, she would fold her bedding neatly and drive to the 24-hour gym where she had maintained a membership during better times. For $12 a month, she could shower, use clean restrooms, and pretend for a few precious minutes that she was just another person starting their day normally. The gym staff never questioned why she arrived so early or why she sometimes lingered in the parking lot afterward, engine running to keep warm. Work at the grocery store became increasingly challenging as her belly expanded. By 7 months, she could barely maneuver between the narrow aisles with her cart of products to restock. Her supervisor had been patient at first, even sympathetic when Rachel explained her situation in vague terms. But patience wore thin when Rachel had to take frequent breaks, her back screaming in protest as she lifted heavy boxes of canned goods. "Maybe it's time you considered maternity leave," Mrs. Olsen suggested one night, though they both knew Rachel couldn't afford unpaid time off. The words hung between them like a death sentence. Rachel worked until her water broke during her shift at 38 weeks, crouched between towers of breakfast cereal boxes as the first contraction hit her like a lightning bolt. Mrs. Olsen drove her to the hospital, squeezing her hand during the worst of the contractions as they waited for the ambulance that seemed to take forever to arrive. David came into the world at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Weighing 6 pounds and 2 ounces, he was perfect, tiny fingers that gripped Rachel's thumb with surprising strength, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with solemn curiosity, and lungs that announced his arrival to the entire maternity ward. When the nurse placed him on Rachel's chest for the first time, still slick and warm from birth, she felt something shift inside her chest, a fierce, protective love unlike anything she had ever experienced. "He's beautiful," the nurse said softly, and Rachel looked down at her son's face, searching for traces of Harry in his features. But David looked only like himself, unique and precious and entirely hers. The hospital social worker appeared the next morning, clipboard in hand, and concern etched across her features. "Miss Jaziri, we need to discuss your discharge plan. Do you have a stable living situation for you and the baby?" Rachel had practiced this conversation in her head, but the words still felt like lies on her tongue. "Yes, I have a place." The social worker's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, but without proof otherwise, she couldn't intervene. Rachel was discharged 48 hours later with a car seat donated by the hospital, a small supply of formula and diapers, and instructions to follow up with a pediatrician within a week. Living in the car with a newborn proved exponentially more difficult than being homeless alone. David cried often, his small voice echoing in the confined space as Rachel tried desperately to soothe him while remaining inconspicuous. She discovered that parking lots at 24-hour establishments were safest: McDonald's, Walmart, gas stations where the constant flow of customers made one more car unremarkable. But even those havens came with risks. The first real scare happened when David was 3 weeks old. Rachel had parked behind a shuttered restaurant, exhausted from another sleepless night, when footsteps approaching the car jolted her awake. Through the fogged windows, she could see 2 figures circling the Honda, testing door handles. "Someone's in there," a gravelly voice said. Rachel held David tighter, her heart hammering as she remained perfectly still. One of the figures pressed his face against the driver's side window, cupping his hands to peer inside. She could smell alcohol and cigarettes even through the glass. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they moved on, apparently deciding she wasn't worth the trouble. The police encounters were almost worse because they came with the authority of law. Officers would tap on her window with measured politeness, asking for identification and an explanation for her presence. Rachel became expert at appearing apologetic, but temporary, just pulled over for a phone call, just taking a break from driving, just about to leave. "Mom, you can't sleep here," became a familiar refrain. "Move along." Each time she would start the engine with shaking hands and drive until she found another spot, another temporary refuge. Her savings, meager to begin with, evaporated quickly. Gas for the car, formula when her milk supply proved insufficient, diapers, the basic necessities of keeping a baby alive, consumed what little money she had left. The morning everything changed started like any other. David was fussing, hungry, and in need of a clean diaper, while Rachel counted the crumpled bills in her wallet. $7.32. Enough for formula or diapers, but not both. She made the choice every mother would make. David's immediate needs came first. The convenience store was busy with morning commuters grabbing coffee and gas. Rachel parked close to the entrance, engine running, David secured in his car seat. She would be quick, she told herself. Just grab the formula and go. She had done this same routine dozens of times before. But routine became catastrophe in the span of 5 minutes. When she emerged from the store, receipt still clutched in her hand, the parking space where her Honda should have been was empty. For a moment, her mind simply couldn't process what she was seeing. She looked around frantically, thinking perhaps she had misremembered where she parked, perhaps. Then reality hit her like a physical blow. Her car was gone, her home was gone, and David. "My baby!" The words tore from her throat as she spun around, searching frantically. "Someone took my car. My baby's in the car." The scene that followed was chaos. Police sirens, frantic radio calls, witnesses trying to remember details about a car they hadn't really noticed. But for Rachel, the world had narrowed to a single devastating truth. David was gone, taken by someone who had stolen not just her car, but her entire world. She answered the officer's questions mechanically, providing David's description, his age, what he had been wearing. But inside she was fracturing, her mind unable to fully grasp the magnitude of what had happened. This was her worst nightmare made real, not just losing her home, but losing the one person who made that home bearable. 20 agonizing minutes passed before the radio crackled with news. A patrol unit had found an infant in a car seat on the shoulder of Highway 9, about 2 miles from the store. The baby appeared unharmed but was crying inconsolably. "That's him!" "That's David!" Rachel screamed, not caring who heard her desperation. Standing there holding David close while police filed their reports and paramedics confirmed he was unharmed, Rachel realized she had reached the absolute bottom. No car, no home, no possessions, no money, no options left. The social worker's business card tucked into David's diaper bag, one of the few items left with the abandoned car seat, suddenly felt like the heaviest object in the world. She got out and walked. She kept walking until her legs hurt and she couldn't no more. It was then that she noticed the bridge, a concrete overpass visible from where she stood, with shadows underneath that suggested shelter. She had seen homeless encampments there before, had driven past them with the comfortable distance of someone who still had a roof over her head. Now, that distance had vanished entirely. With David in her arms and their few remaining possessions in a plastic bag, Rachel walked toward the bridge. Each step felt like a surrender, but also like a strange kind of determination. She had fallen as far as it was possible to fall, but she was still breathing, still walking, still holding her son. Under the bridge, she found remnants of previous occupants, cardboard softened by rain, a torn tent that might still provide some protection, the detritus of lives lived on the margins. As David cooed softly in her arms, seemingly unaware that his entire world had just shifted, Rachel felt tears slide down her cheeks. Not the violent sobs of complete breakdown, but the quiet tears of someone who had finally stopped falling and found solid ground, even if that ground was concrete and cardboard. The concrete felt like ice against Rachel's back when she woke, though the thin light filtering through the torn tent suggested it was well past dawn. Her stomach cramped with a hunger so fierce it felt like her body was consuming itself from the inside out. Beside her, David stirred in his makeshift bed, making the soft, mewling sounds that meant he would be demanding food soon. Rachel sat up slowly, every muscle protesting after a night on the hard ground. The tent she'd found was better than nothing, but rain had seeped through holes she hadn't noticed in the darkness, leaving damp patches that chilled her to the bone. She pulled David close, feeling his small body's warmth against her chest, and tried to ignore the way her breasts ached with the effort of producing milk when her body had so little fuel to work with. "Good morning, baby," she whispered, pressing her lips to the soft fuzz on top of his head. "Mama's going to find us some breakfast." The walk to the corner store felt longer than usual, each step requiring conscious effort as her empty stomach sent waves of dizziness through her skull. With the $7 and change clutched in her palm, money that felt both precious and pitifully inadequate, she stood before the shelves calculating nutrition per penny with the precision of a mathematician. The peanut butter sandwich tasted like salvation. Rachel ate slowly, forcing herself to savor each bite rather than wolfing it down, despite her body's desperate signals. She needed this food to last, needed to stretch these calories as far as they would go. When David began fussing, she walked to the small park 3 blocks away, a place where mothers brought their children to play, where she could blend in for a few precious moments. Sitting on the worn wooden bench, she lifted her shirt and guided David to her breast, feeling the familiar tug and release as he began to nurse. Around them, the normal world continued its rhythm. Joggers passing by with earbuds and determined expressions, dog walkers chatting about weekend plans, the distant sound of children laughing on playground equipment. For a moment, Rachel allowed herself to pretend she belonged to this world of ordinary concerns and simple pleasures. But reality crept in like fog, bringing with it thoughts she didn't want to entertain. Was this her destiny? To live in shadows and survive on scraps, raising her son in a tent under a bridge? She had always believed that hard work could overcome any obstacle. But what happened when there was no work to be found, no ladder to climb, no path forward that didn't require resources she simply didn't possess? The thought was suffocating, pressing down on her chest until she struggled to breathe. She closed her eyes and tried to find something, anything to hold on to. David's warm weight in her arms, the fact that they were both alive, both whole, her own 2 hands capable of work if she could just find someone willing to pay for it. "As long as we can move, we can keep going," she murmured to David, who had fallen asleep at her breast, his tiny fist curled against her skin. "We just need to keep moving." The idea came to her gradually. born from desperation but nurtured by determination. She had cleaned houses before, had worked harder than most people ever would. If the system wouldn't provide for her, she would create her own opportunities, house by house, door by door, until someone said yes. The first neighborhood she tried was a disaster. Well-maintained lawns and security system stickers on windows proclaimed a level of affluence that made her presence feel like an intrusion. When she knocked on doors, clutching David to her chest, the responses ranged from suspicious to openly hostile. "We're not interested," came the refrain, often before she could even explain what she was offering. One woman took a long look at David, then at Rachel's unwashed hair and clothes that had seen too many days without proper laundering. "You shouldn't be taking a baby door to door like this. Someone should call social services." The words hit Rachel like a physical blow. She hurried away from that house, heart pounding with a fear that went deeper than hunger or homelessness. Losing David would mean losing everything that mattered, the one pure thing in her life that made all the struggle worthwhile. By the 4th Street, she had modified her approach. Instead of launching directly into her request, she tried to establish herself as a person, first, someone with a story, a reason for being there that went beyond mere desperation. The house at the end of Maple Street was smaller than the others, with a garden that showed signs of loving care despite being somewhat overgrown. When the door opened, Rachel found herself looking down at an elderly woman who barely reached her shoulder, leaning heavily on a wooden cane worn smooth by years of use. "Can I help you, dear?" The voice was kind but cautious, the tone of someone who had learned to be careful but hadn't yet given up on people entirely. Rachel took a breath, David stirring sleepily in her arms. "Mom, my name is Rachel, and I'm going to be honest with you. I'm homeless. Someone stole my car with all my belongings, and I have a baby to take care of. I'm not asking for charity, I'm asking for work. I can clean houses and I work harder than anyone you'll ever hire. If you need any help around here, I'd be grateful for the chance to earn some money." She held her breath, watching the woman's face for signs of rejection or fear. Instead, she saw something unexpected. Recognition. Not of Rachel herself, but of the particular kind of desperation that came from being backed against a wall with no way out. "What's the baby's name?" the woman asked, adjusting her glasses to get a better look at David. "David. He's 3 months old." The woman nodded slowly, as if this information helped her make up her mind about something. "I'm Vivian. And yes, I could use some help around here. I don't have much money to pay you, but—" "Anything would help," Rachel said quickly. "Any amount at all." Vivian studied her for another long moment, then stepped aside to let them in. "Well then, come inside. Let's see what we can figure out." The house was small but immaculately kept, filled with the kind of furniture that spoke of decades of careful use rather than frequent replacement. Photographs covered the mantelpiece, family gatherings, holidays, a lifetime of memories captured in silver frames. Rachel felt a pang of longing for the stability these images represented, the continuity of belonging somewhere. "You can put the baby down on the couch," Vivian said, settling into an armchair with visible relief. "He'll be safe there while you work." Rachel arranged David carefully on the soft cushions, building a barrier of throw pillows around him. He was still sleepy from his feeding, content to observe his surroundings with the grave attention babies gave to new environments. For the next 3 hours, Rachel cleaned with a focus that bordered on meditation. Every surface was dusted, every floor vacuumed and mopped, every bathroom fixture scrubbed until it gleamed. She worked with the efficiency of someone who understood that this might be her only chance to prove herself, that the quality of her work could determine whether she ate today or went to bed hungry. Vivian watched her work with growing amazement. This wasn't the desperate flailing of someone trying to manipulate sympathy. This was the methodical competence of a professional who happened to be down on her luck. Midway through cleaning the kitchen, Rachel heard voices from the living room. Vivian's gentle murmur mixed with David's soft coos of response. She paused in her scrubbing to listen. and what she heard made tears spring to her eyes. "Your mama is working so hard, little one," Vivian was saying, her voice taking on the musical quality people used with babies. "She loves you so much, doesn't she? She's doing all this for you to make sure you're taken care of. You're a lucky boy to have someone who loves you that much." Rachel pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. When had anyone last spoken about her with such understanding? When had anyone recognized the love that drove her forward, rather than focusing on the circumstances that had brought her low? She wiped her eyes on her sleeve and returned to her work with renewed vigor, scrubbing away not just dirt, but some of the shame that had been accumulating like dust in the corners of her heart. When she finally emerged from the last bedroom, exhausted but satisfied with her work, she found Vivian sitting with David cradled in her arms, both of them looking perfectly content with the arrangement. "He's beautiful," Vivian said, looking up at Rachel with tears in her own eyes. "You have a beautiful son." "Thank you," Rachel managed, though the words felt inadequate for the gratitude flooding her chest. Vivian's voice took on a different tone, more practical but no less kind. "I put a clean towel in the bathroom, dear. You and David should have a proper wash, too." The offer was so unexpected, so perfectly attuned to her needs, that Rachel felt her composure crack entirely. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," Vivian said firmly. "You worked hard today, and you deserve to feel human again." The shower was a revelation. Afterward, she bathed David in the sink, marveling at how different he looked when truly clean, pink-cheeked and perfect, unmarked by the circumstances of their life. When she emerged from the bathroom, she found that Vivian had heated leftovers from the night before, pot roast with vegetables, the kind of home-cooked meal Rachel had almost forgotten existed. "Sit," Vivian commanded, and Rachel was too grateful to argue. The food was a miracle of flavour and substance. As she ate, Vivian asked about her story with the gentle persistence of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. Rachel found herself telling it all. The pregnancy, the blisters, Harry's betrayal, the car theft, the tent under the bridge. She had expected to feel ashamed recounting these failures, but instead felt oddly relieved to have someone witness the full scope of what she had endured. When she finished, Vivian sat quietly for a long moment, studying Rachel's face with an expression of profound sadness mixed with something that might have been admiration. "You know," Vivian said finally, "I think you might be one of the strongest women I've ever met." Rachel laughed bitterly. "Strong? I'm living under a bridge." "Exactly," Vivian said. "You're living under a bridge, caring for an infant, and you still got up this morning determined to find work rather than give up. You're still fighting. That's not weakness, dear. That's the kind of strength most people never have to discover they possess." She pulled her purse from the side table and counted out 5 $20 bills, pressing them into Rachel's hand despite her protests. "This is all I have until my pension check comes," Vivian said, "but I want you to take it." Rachel stared at the money, overwhelmed by the generosity. $100 wouldn't solve all her problems, but it would buy food, diapers, maybe a few nights in a motel where David could sleep in a real bed. "There's something else," Vivian continued. "You don't have to go back to that bridge tonight. I live alone in this big house, and there's plenty of room for you and David." The offer hung between them like a lifeline, and Rachel felt the pull of it with every fibre of her being. A warm bed, regular meals, a roof that wouldn't leak in the rain. But accepting felt like crossing a line from independence into charity, from temporary hardship into permanent dependence. "You've already done so much," Rachel said. "I can't impose on you like that." "It wouldn't be an imposition." "Yes, it would," Rachel said gently but firmly. "You barely know me. Having strangers in your house, a baby crying at night, it's too much to ask." Vivian looked disappointed but not surprised. "You're proud," she observed. "That's not entirely a bad thing." Rachel nodded, understanding the wisdom in the words even as she remained unable to act on it. "There is one thing you could help me with, if you're willing. Do you know anyone else in the neighborhood who might need cleaning help? I'd like to build up some regular work." Vivian's face brightened. "Oh, I know several people who would benefit from your services. Mrs. Patterson across the street has been struggling since her hip surgery, and the Johnsons at the corner have been talking about needing help with their spring cleaning for months." And so a routine was born. Rachel would return to Maple Street twice a week, sometimes more, building a small network of clients who appreciated her thoroughness and reliability. She invested in a better tent, then a camping mattress that kept her off the cold ground. The bridge began to feel less like a desperate shelter and more like a temporary arrangement, a stepping stone to something better. David grew stronger, his serious dark eyes tracking movement with increasing awareness. Vivian became his unofficial grandmother, always having time to hold him while Rachel worked, speaking to him in the gentle tones that made Rachel's heart ache with gratitude. The work wasn't easy, scrubbing floors while her son slept nearby, carrying him from house to house in the carrier that had become as essential as her cleaning supplies. But it was honest work that she could take pride in, a foundation on which to build something resembling a life. Some nights, lying in the tent with David sleeping peacefully beside her, Rachel allowed herself to dream beyond mere survival. Maybe she could save enough money for a security deposit on a small apartment. Maybe David could go to school without shame, could grow up knowing that his mother had never stopped fighting for their future. The bridge that sheltered them was still just concrete and steel, the tent still just fabric and hope. But something had changed in the weeks since that first desperate morning. Rachel was no longer just surviving, she was building. One day, one job, one small act of human kindness at a time. That fateful morning started like any other under the bridge. Rachel stirred in her sleeping bag as pale sunlight filtered through the gaps in her tent, creating patches of warmth that she instinctively moved toward. David, now 5 months old, was still sleeping peacefully beside her, his small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm that had become her most precious sound in the world. But something was different today. A persistent barking echoed off the concrete supports, growing louder and more insistent. Rachel's first instinct was fear. Stray dogs could be dangerous, especially around a baby. She had heard stories from other homeless people about aggressive animals scavenging in camps like theirs. Carefully, she unzipped the tent flap and peered outside. What she saw made her smile despite her apprehension. A beautiful golden Labrador sat just outside her tent, tail wagging with such enthusiasm his entire body wiggled. His tongue hung out in a friendly pant, and his eyes held the kind of gentle intelligence that marked him as someone's beloved companion. "Well, hello there," Rachel said softly, extending her hand for the dog to sniff. "You're a friendly one, aren't you?" The dog immediately pushed his head into her palm, clearly starved for attention and affection. His collar was leather and well-maintained, with a shiny tag that caught the morning light. This was definitely not a stray. "David, look what we have here," Rachel whispered, carefully lifting her son from his makeshift bed. David's eyes widened with fascination as he took in this new creature, his small hands reaching out instinctively. The dog seemed to understand the precious nature of his new audience, sitting perfectly still as David's tiny fingers brushed against his fur. His tail never stopped wagging, but he remained gentle and calm, as if he knew he was in the presence of something fragile and important. "Milo! Milo, where are you, you rascal?" The voice came from somewhere above them, echoing off the bridge's concrete structure. Rachel looked up to see an elderly man in expensive-looking white pants and a button-down shirt making his way down the steep embankment that led to the homeless encampment. He moved carefully, using small bushes and concrete ledges for support, clearly not accustomed to such terrain. "Milo! Come back here right now!" the man called again, his voice carrying a mixture of exasperation and concern. The dog, Milo apparently, looked between Rachel and the approaching voice, torn between his new friends and his obvious responsibility to his owner. His tail wagged even harder as if he was trying to communicate that he had made a wonderful discovery. As the man navigated the final few feet of his descent, Rachel watched his expensive shoes struggle for purchase on the loose gravel and debris. He was clearly out of his element here, his clean clothes and careful grooming marking him as someone from a very different world than the one she inhabited. It happened in slow motion. One moment the man was reaching for a concrete support beam, the next his foot slipped on a patch of loose dirt and he tumbled backward, landing hard on his backside. The pristine white pants were instantly covered in mud and grime, and Rachel could see him wince as he hit the ground. "Oh no!" Rachel called out, instinctively moving toward him. "Are you hurt?" The man looked up, clearly embarrassed, and somewhat rattled. His initial expression of irritation at Milo's escapade softened when he saw Rachel standing there with David in her arms. She could see him taking in their situation, the tent, the makeshift living arrangement, her own worn clothing, and his demeanor shifted entirely. I'm fine," he said, accepting Rachel's offered hand to help him to his feet. "Just my pride that's wounded." He brushed ineffectively at his ruined pants, then gave up with a rueful laugh. "Milo here has a habit of running off whenever he catches an interesting scent." "He's beautiful," Rachel said, watching as Milo continued to wag his entire body with joy at having both his favourite people in the same place. "Very friendly." "Too friendly sometimes," the man said, but his voice held obvious affection. "I'm sorry if he bothered you." He's usually good about staying close, but sometimes. He trailed off, seeming to notice David for the first time. "Oh, you have a baby." I hope he didn't wake him. David was already stirring, Rachel assured him, and honestly it was nice to have a visitor. Milo's been very gentle with him. The man smiled, and Rachel noticed how the expression transformed his face. He was probably in his 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. There was something distinguished about him, even covered in mud, that spoke of education and refinement. They talked for several minutes about Milo's habits and David's age, the kind of pleasant small talk that Rachel rarely got to engage in anymore. Most people either ignored her entirely or looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. This man treated her like a person, like someone worth having a conversation with. As their chat began to wind down and the man prepared to leash Milo for the walk back to wherever they had come from, he paused and looked directly into Rachel's eyes. Something in his expression shifted, becoming more serious, more searching. "I hope you don't mind me asking," he said carefully, "but do you have any family? Any relatives, perhaps overseas?" The question caught Rachel off guard. She laughed, but without humour. "I wish I did. I don't even know who my parents were." The man's face grew thoughtful, and he seemed to be wrestling with some internal decision. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said quietly. Then, almost hesitantly, he added, "Does the name Jaziri mean anything to you?" "The last name Jaziri?" Rachel's world tilted. The name hit her like a physical blow, and she felt David shift in her arms as her grip tightened involuntarily. Her eyes widened, and she could feel her heart beginning to race. That's my last name," she whispered. "How do you know my last name?" The man's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. His face went completely white, then flushed red, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. He stared at her with an intensity that was almost frightening, his eyes filling with tears that began to spill down his cheeks unchecked. "Oh my God," he breathed, his voice cracking. "Oh my God, oh my God." His legs seemed to give out slightly and he reached for Milo's collar to steady himself. "Sir." "Sir, are you okay?" Rachel asked, alarmed by the dramatic change in his condition. "Should I call someone?" "I found her," the man whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I finally found her. After all these years, I found her." "Found who?" Rachel asked, though something deep in her chest was already beginning to understand, even as her mind rejected the possibility. The man looked up at her through his tears, his face a mixture of joy and disbelief, and something that looked like awe. "My daughter," he said. "I found my daughter." Rachel felt the world spin around her. She looked down at David, then back at this stranger who was claiming to be her father, trying to process what was happening. "I don't understand," she said. "How can you possibly know that? How can you be sure?" But the man was crying openly now, pressing his face into Milo's fur and thanking God and the dog alternately for leading him to this place, this moment. It took several minutes before he could compose himself enough to speak coherently. "Please," he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Please, sit down. Let me tell you a story, and then you can decide for yourself whether you believe me." They sat on a piece of cardboard that Rachel spread on the ground, David contentedly gnawing on his fist while she tried to prepare herself for whatever she was about to hear. "My name is Michael Harden," the man began, his voice still shaky with emotion. 41 years ago, I was a graduate student in international business. That's when I met Hadia Jaziri, a beautiful, brilliant young woman from Morocco who was studying literature on an exchange program. Rachel found herself holding her breath as Michael continued his story, painting a picture of young love that bloomed between two people from very different worlds. He spoke of long conversations about poetry and politics, of shared dreams and growing intimacy. "We fell in love," Michael said simply. "It wasn't planned, it wasn't practical, but it was real. And when Hadia discovered she was pregnant, we were both scared but excited. We talked about getting married, about finding a way to make it work despite the cultural differences." Rachel could see the pain in his eyes as his story took a darker turn. But Hadia was terrified of her family's reaction. Her father was very traditional, very strict. The idea of his unmarried daughter having a child with an American man. She knew it would destroy her relationship with her family, possibly forever. Michael's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "One day, I went to her apartment and she was gone. Just gone. All her things, her books, everything. The landlord said she had paid her rent and left during the night. She had completely disappeared." "You tried to find her?" Rachel asked, though she already knew the answer from the anguish in his voice. "I tried everything," Michael confirmed. "I contacted the university, her friends, anyone who might know where she had gone. I even tried to reach out to people in Morocco, but I didn't have much to go on. She had effectively erased herself from my life." He was quiet for a long moment, lost in memories that were clearly still painful after all these years. "I searched for 10 years, he continued, on and off, whenever I could afford to hire private investigators or when I had new leads to follow. Finally, I found someone who had known Hadia's family, someone who could give me her aunt's phone number in Casablanca." Rachel found herself leaning forward, desperate to hear the rest of the story that might explain her own existence. "I called the aunt," Michael said. "She was suspicious at first, but when I explained who I was and why I was calling, she agreed to talk to me. What she told me broke my heart all over again." The pain in Michael's voice was fresh, as if the conversation had happened yesterday rather than decades ago. Hadia's father had been furious when he learned about the pregnancy. He had forbidden her from ever leaving Morocco again. To preserve the family's honor, he had arranged a marriage for her with a local man who was willing to overlook her past. "And the baby?" Rachel whispered, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. "According to the aunt, Hadia gave birth to a daughter." But that's all the information she would give me. She said that Hadia had made a new life, that she was happy, and that I should never try to contact the family again. Then she hung up, and I never heard from any of them again. Michael looked directly at Rachel, his eyes still bright with unshed tears. "But I never stopped looking for you," he said. I never stopped hoping that someday, somehow I would find my daughter and be able to tell her that she was wanted, that she was loved, that not a day went by that I didn't think about her. Rachel sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile this story with what little she knew of her own origins. The note that had been found with her as a baby, requesting that she be given the last name Jaziri. The features that she was now beginning to recognize in Michael's face, the shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, even the way he gestured when he spoke. "The church where you were found," Michael said as if reading her thoughts. "It was St. Mary's, wasn't it? On 5th Street? Rachel nodded, unable to speak. That was the church where Hadia and I used to walk sometimes. She said it reminded her of the beautiful architecture in Morocco, that it made her feel peaceful. The pieces were falling into place with a clarity that was almost overwhelming. Rachel looked at this man, her father, and felt years of questions beginning to find their answers. It was then that David chose to wake up fully, stretching and making the small, demanding sounds that meant he was hungry. The baby's cry seemed to bring Michael back to the present moment, and his eyes widened as the full implications hit him. "Is he... Am I a grandfather?" Michael asked, his voice filled with wonder. "This is David," Rachel said, adjusting her son in her arms. "He's 5 months old." Michael's face crumpled again, but this time the tears seemed to be of joy rather than sorrow. "A grandson," he whispered. "I have a grandson." He looked around at their living situation, the tent, the makeshift arrangements, the obvious poverty, and Rachel could see something shift in his expression. The wonder and joy remained, but they were joined by determination and what looked like anger at the circumstances that had brought his daughter to this place. "This ends now," he said firmly. "You're not staying here another night. Both of you are coming home with me." "Sir Michael," Rachel corrected herself, still struggling with the reality of the situation. "I appreciate the offer, but you don't really know me." "Just because we might be related doesn't mean..." "Doesn't mean what?" Michael interrupted. "That I should care about my daughter and grandson living under a bridge? That I should drive away and pretend this conversation never happened?" He stood up, brushing off his ruined pants, and extended his hand to help Rachel to her feet. "I've spent 40 years looking for you," he said. "I'm not leaving without you now." The transition from homelessness to wealth happened with a surreal swiftness that left Rachel feeling dizzy and displaced. Michael's Mercedes felt like a spaceship compared to the beaten-up Honda she had lost months earlier. But nothing could have prepared her for Michael's home. The mansion sat on several acres of perfectly manicured grounds, its Mediterranean-style architecture speaking of both wealth and exquisite taste. Rachel found herself pressing her face to the window like a child, trying to take in the enormity of what she was seeing. "This is where you live," she whispered. Michael smiled, though she could see him watching her reaction carefully. "This is where we live now," he corrected gently. Inside, the house was even more impressive. High ceilings, beautiful artwork, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Rachel clutched David tighter, suddenly terrified that they would break something or leave dirt on the pristine surfaces. "How?" she asked, looking around at the obvious signs of serious wealth. Michael's smile became more genuine. "I started a ceramic tile company after graduate school," he explained, specialized in handcrafted tiles inspired by Moroccan designs. "I suppose it was my way of staying connected to Hadia, to that part of my life." The business did well, very well. Over the following days and weeks, Rachel learned more about her father's success. His company supplied high-end hotels and luxury homes around the world with tiles that were considered works of art. He employed hundreds of people and had built an empire from his memories of a lost love and a missing daughter. But wealth, Rachel discovered, came with its own complications. Michael insisted on hiring nannies for David, on providing everything she could possibly need. on making up for years of absence with an overwhelming generosity that left her feeling suffocated. "I want to keep working," she told him one morning over breakfast in his formal dining room, a space larger than most apartments she had ever lived in. "Working?" Michael looked genuinely puzzled. "Why would you need to work? You have everything you could want here." "Because work is who I am," Rachel explained, trying to make him understand. "I'm not someone who can just exist. I need to do something meaningful with my days." Michael studied her face, and she could see him trying to reconcile the daughter he had imagined with the woman sitting before him. "What kind of work?" "I want to continue cleaning houses," Rachel said, watching his expression carefully. "I know it doesn't sound glamorous, but I'm good at it. I like it. It's honest work, and there are people who depend on me." The look on Michael's face suggested this was not the answer he had been hoping for, but after a long pause he nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "But David stays here with the nannies." The adjustment period was harder than Rachel had anticipated. Living in luxury should have been easy, but she found herself walking carefully through rooms filled with valuable objects, afraid to touch anything, afraid to disturb the perfect order that money could buy. But slowly, understanding began to grow between them. Michael started to see that his daughter had been shaped by experiences he couldn't imagine, that her strength came from places he had never had to visit. And Rachel began to understand that his love was real, even if it came wrapped in wealth and privilege that felt foreign to her. The cleaning business she built over the following year was entirely her own creation. Michael offered help repeatedly, but Rachel refused, determined to prove that she could succeed on her own terms. She hired employees, expanded her client base, built a reputation for excellence and reliability that had nothing to do with her father's money. When the offer came to buy her company 4 years later, a $1 million deal that would set her up for life, Rachel took weeks to make the decision. The business had become more than just work. It was proof that she could create something valuable, something meaningful. But David was growing, and she realized that the most important job she would ever have was being his mother. The money from the sale would ensure his future, would give him opportunities she had never dreamed of. The first thing she did with the check was arrange a surprise for Vivian, a Mediterranean cruise that the older woman had mentioned dreaming about for years. When she told Michael about her plan, she was surprised by his immediate offer to accompany Vivian on the trip. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," he said. "Someone who showed you kindness when you needed it most." "I'd be honored to meet her." Watching her father and Vivian hit it off during their pre-cruise dinner was one of the most unexpectedly joyful moments of Rachel's new life. Two people who had both known loss, both understood the value of human kindness, finding friendship and perhaps something more in their shared appreciation for second chances. As Rachel tucked David into his bed, a real bed, in a real room with a nightlight and stuffed animals and all the security she had once only dreamed of providing, she reflected on the extraordinary turns her life had taken, from abandonment to love, from homelessness to wealth, from despair to hope. None of it had happened the way she might have planned, but somehow it had all led her exactly where she needed to be. "Sweet dreams, my love," she whispered to her son, kissing his forehead. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what our next adventure will be." Outside the window, the stars shone down on the beautiful grounds of their home, the same stars that had once watched over a tent under a bridge where a young mother had whispered promises to her sleeping baby. Some promises, Rachel had learned, had a way of coming true in the most unexpected ways. The sound of laughter filled Michael's house in a way it never had before. Rachel stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her father and Vivian share stories from their Mediterranean cruise, their faces glowing with the kind of contentment that came from unexpected companionship in the later chapters of life. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, Vivian helping Michael with dinner while he regaled her with tales of the ceramic workshops they'd visited in Italy. David was now 5 years old. He asked a lot of questions. Rachel smiled, ruffling her son's hair. Somehow, in the natural way children adapted to new realities, David had seamlessly incorporated both Michael and Vivian into his understanding of family. Milo, the golden retriever who had orchestrated their miraculous reunion, had become David's constant companion. Later that evening, after David had been tucked into bed and Vivian had settled into the guest room that was increasingly becoming her permanent space, Rachel found Michael on the terrace overlooking his gardens. He was holding an old photograph, worn soft at the edges from years of handling. "Is that her?" Rachel asked, settling into the chair beside him. Michael nodded, holding the photo so she could see. The woman in the picture was indeed beautiful. Dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets, an elegant bone structure, and a smile that was both mysterious and warm. Rachel could see traces of herself in those features, the legacy of a mother she had never known. "She was remarkable," Michael said softly. "Brilliant, funny, passionate about literature and life. She used to read to me in Arabic, and even though I couldn't understand the words, the sound of her voice..." He trailed off, lost in memory. Rachel had asked about Hadia many times over the past few years, hungry for details about the woman who had given her life. With each story, she felt both closer to and further from her mother, understanding the love that had created her, but also the fear that had led to her abandonment. "She gave me everything she could," Rachel said after a long silence. "And maybe the kindest thing I can do is respect the choice she made. She built a new life, probably had other children. Me appearing now might only bring pain." Michael studied his daughter's face, seeing in it the wisdom that had been forged through years of struggle and survival. "You've grown into an extraordinary woman," he said, "strong in ways I never had to be." Rachel smiled, thinking of the journey that had brought her here, from the church steps to foster homes, from Harry's betrayal to life under the bridge, from Vivian's kindness to this moment of peace and plenty. Every hardship had taught her something. Every loss had made her more resilient. "I used to be angry about all of it," she said. "Now I think maybe I needed to go through all that to appreciate what we have." Tomorrow, Rachel would take David to school, where he was thriving among friends who would never know the fear of homelessness or hunger. Vivian would tend the herb garden she'd planted behind the kitchen, and Michael would work on expanding his business to include a scholarship program for young parents in difficult circumstances. Rachel's idea, born from her own experience. They were all different people than they'd been 5 years ago, shaped by loss and redemption, by the discovery that family could be created as surely as it could be born. Rachel had learned that strength wasn't about never falling down, it was about getting back up again and again until you found your way home. "I love you, Dad," she said, the words still feeling new and precious on her tongue. "I love you too, daughter," Michael replied. "I always have." As they sat together under the stars, Rachel felt the deep contentment that came from knowing she had finally found where she belonged. Not because of wealth or comfort, but because she was surrounded by people who had chosen to love her, just as she had chosen to love them in return. She was Rachel Jaziri Harden now, daughter, mother, survivor, and something more. A woman who had learned that the strongest foundations were built not on what you were given, but on what you chose to create from the broken pieces of your life.